finally come and crash the party. I know this is a little bit of a departure from your usual Wednesday night. But I wanted, as a member of the advisory board, to be able to come and share with you something that I think is pretty important as you think about your long-term planning and your strategy, not only for your project, but ultimately for the presentation. So my goal this evening is to really just provide some coaching for you based on the 36-year career that I had at Procter & Gamble. I spent about half of that career in sales and about half of the career in marketing. And I ended up as the senior marketing manager for U.S. grocery and ethnic marketing, which was well over a $2 billion business for P&G. So I have, some background. I've given a lot of presentations over the years. And I've crashed and burned quite a few times, more than I'd like to admit, and thankfully been successful with a few. So I'm hoping that what I can share tonight will help you to equip you to develop not only your projects, but do a better job on your presentations with your Enactus projects. And the great thing about Enactus is they're incredibly transparent about what it's going to take to win. Everything you need to know about winning with your project is on their website. It's right there. You can see exactly how you're going to be evaluated, not only for your project, but for your presentation. And there's 5 criteria they list there. They say, did you first consider the relevant economic, social, and environmental factors? Did you effectively empower your target audience? Did you target people in need? Did you apply business and economic concepts and entrepreneurial approach? And did you improve the quality of life and standard of living for your target audience? So if your project isn't going to hit on all 5 of those, their little scale, you're going to get marked down. So if your project doesn't hit, now's a good time to really think about how can I build my project so it really nails all 5 of those things. So to win the Enactus competition, you've got to do 2 things. First of all, you need to develop and execute a project that nails all 5 of those basic standards that you're going to be judged on. And second, and perhaps more important even, is you need to figure out how to present to the judging panel in a way that differentiates you from the other 1,600 colleges and universities that are competing. Because no matter how good your project is, if you can't figure out how to convey that with excellence and in a way that differentiates you from 1,600 other people, you won't end up with the global trophy. How many of you have watched the U.S. World Cup winner from 2012, their presentation, Belmont, from the United States, outside of Nashville? How many? I saw 2 hands. Okay, that's a global winner right here out of the United States, Nashville. Little private school, smaller than Azusa Pacific, and they won global. How about anybody that's watched the 2013 winner? It was the Technical University from Munich, Germany. 1 hand. These are the people that set the bar. They won. You can tell from their presentation why they won. And when you look back at the Azusa Pacific presentation from last year or the year before, you'll see a huge difference between what was delivered from here and what they delivered. So that tells you, that gap tells you what you have to do to win. So tonight I want to focus really just on this presentation aspect. So what was immediately apparent in watching these 2 from 2012 and 2013 is not only did they have good projects, but they created presentations that completely differentiated them from everybody else. They were incredibly good in their delivery, and that's why they won. So how many of you, show of hands, you've watched a movie or you've read a book that just gripped you until the very end? Everybody? Okay. How about, show of hands again, how many of you remember a Bible study or a Bible story from maybe when you were in Sunday school as a little kid? How many of you remember any of those stories? Okay, what are some of them? Tell me.
Jonah and the fish.
Jonah and the fish? David and Goliath? Joseph. Leave out the Technicolor Dreamcoat part of the story. That's probably a paraphrase. Anybody else?
The Exodus.
Exodus story, all right? Yeah. All right, great. Okay, so this is a Bible school. How many of you have a sense of what percentage of the Bible is narrative or story in its format? What are your guesses?
86% of those.
Out of the 66 books, how many of them are generally classified, not books, but individual parts of books are generally classified as narrative or story?
89%.
89%. We have 89 over here. Any other takers?
95.
95. 71.
83.
83. You guys are all in the ballpark. This is really good. Generally accepted scholars say about 75% of all the scripture is narrative or story. About 15% is poetic, and only about 10% of the Bible is actually instructional in nature. And we today, we tend to turn that around, and we tend to have 75 or 80% of what we do be instructional, and just a small portion of what we do is story. But God wired us for story. That's why so much of the Bible is story. Story, it connects with us in a way that facts and figures just don't. Story connects with us emotionally and in a way that just pulls us in and makes us hang on. And that's why you guys remember Bible stories that maybe you learned when you were 5 or 6 or 7 years old, and you still remember them. As a sales manager and later as a marketing manager, as I said, I had an opportunity to deliver a lot of presentations. And I learned early on in my career that finding ways to incorporate a little bit of story into my presentations made a huge difference in my success rate, whether I was selling to a customer or whether I was selling to a P&G executive in-house. So that's kind of where I want to go tonight. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about story. And I want to start by telling you a story to illustrate the power of story. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you can incorporate story into your presentations. So I want you to travel with me. We're going to go on a trip. We're all on an airplane, and we're on our way to India. And we're landing in one of the busiest, largest cities of India, Calcutta. It's a city of about 4.6 million people. The average income in Calcutta is a little bit over $400 a year, $424 a year. But we're not going to stay in downtown Calcutta with the high-rise hotels and the beautiful lights and scenery. We're going to get on their version of a taxi, and we're going to go outside the city a little ways to the slums. Tens of thousands of people live in the slums of Calcutta. They live in makeshift homes, if you will, that are really more shelters than anything else. And they're built out of scavenged materials, things that they find along the side of the road or discarded from a construction site somewhere. And the average income in the slum is $110 a year, 30 cents a day. And as we get into the slum, the streets are so narrow that we can't even take the taxi anymore, so we have to get out and walk. And what you notice right away is that the streets are so narrow, even a small car couldn't get down, and there's garbage everywhere, and the humidity is absolutely oppressive, and there's animal and human waste everywhere you look in the streets. The humidity is oppressive, and the stench is absolutely unbearable. And it's nighttime. And out of the corner of your eye, you see a girl, and she's alone, and she looks frightened and even pensive, and she's kind of looking around to see if anybody can see her. And when she's sure she's not being watched, she ducks into an abandoned building, and she finds a corner of the building that isn't littered with debris and droppings from rodents, and she sits down in the dark. And after she sits there for a few minutes, she starts to cry. And then suddenly she screams in agony.
And at that point, this 14-year-old, maybe teenager girl, she lifts up her skirt, and that's when you realize she's pregnant. And she's hidden her pregnancy as long as she can, but now she can't hide it anymore. And so she took a drug earlier in the day, a native drug, and it induces labor, and now the labor pains are on her. And she screams over and over again as this life inside of her tries to fight its way out. She tries to stifle her screams because she doesn't want to attract any attention, but she just can't. And she screams, and finally, with one last scream, this baby emerges and drops to the floor beneath her. And she lies back completely exhausted, and the baby lies motionless at her feet. After a few minutes, suddenly we hear a little sound. This baby is fighting for life. It's fighting for that first gasp of air, and suddenly we hear the baby cry, and we know it's alive. This baby that was seemingly dead is suddenly alive, and this young girl, she looks down at this baby, and she picks it up in her hand, and it's so small it fits in the palm of one hand. And she finds a piece of cardboard, and she puts that baby down on this piece of cardboard. That cardboard is the baby's bed and its casket. Because in this Hindu culture, it's better for this baby to die without sin, so that it can back to life, reincarnated at a higher level. Certainly, if it dies without sin, it'll come back at a level higher than being the bastard child of a 14-year-old girl. She sits and she rests for a few minutes, and then she struggles to her feet. She picks up her little baby with a piece of cardboard, and she leaves the building, and she comes back out of this alley and kind of looks around up and down the street, and she walks a little ways, and she puts the baby down in the gutter of the street. She turns and she walks away into the night mist, leaving her baby in the gutter. A few hours later, a policeman walking his beat, not yet daylight, hears a sound and he can't quite tell where it's coming from. He walks a little bit closer, and as he looks down, he sees the baby sitting on this piece of cardboard. And he picks the baby up and he walks a few blocks to Mother Teresa's hospital. And he drops the baby off at the hospital, and they take care of him there. They bathe him, they feed him, they weigh him and give him a little physical, and he weighs 3.5 pounds. He's estimated to be at least 3 months premature. They don't have any neonatal intensive care units over there, so all they can do is clean him and feed him and hold him, this little baby boy. They named him Taran, which simply means young man. He fights for life. Every day they feed him, gets a little bit stronger and a little bit stronger. Little does he know, in America, thousands of miles away, there's a young couple who can't have their own children, and they're working with an adoption agency. And they're working specifically to adopt a baby from India. And when little Taran is 2 months old, he's finally strong enough to be flown to the United States. And he lands in San Francisco, weighing a whopping 6 pounds at 2 months old, into the arms of his new mom. And his new mom and dad renamed him Kiran. Kiran means ray of light, because he's no longer just a young male, because he's brought a ray of light into their home. There are thousands of Tarans in the world. Most of them don't live. They lose that only a few survive. I think perhaps God is saddened every time a little Taran comes into the world and dies neglected on a piece of cardboard in the gutter of a street that's filled with debris. But I think God smiles every time he sees a little Taran who has a chance to become a Koran. I want to share with you a couple of pictures. This is baby Taran, now named Koran, at 4 months old, weighing a little over 7 pounds. Here he is with his mom in their front yard at 14 months. And here he is today at 31 with his family and his sister, Rebecca, who also was adopted and went to APU. Now, that's not the end of Justin Koran's story. He's special needs, he's legally blind, but we don't have time to tell all the rest of the story. But I tell you the story just so that you understand the impact that one person can have in the world, one family adopting a tiny child, and what can happen over the course of their life. That's a story. That's the power of story. So that's where I want to go with you tonight, is to talk about the art of story. So we're going to leave this imaginary world now, and we're going to move into the dynamics of how do we actually craft a story that will make a difference in your Enactus presentation. So first of all, writing is a continuum. On one end of the continuum, we have what we call reports, and the reports are generally topical. They survey and they collect records and they update data. Their focus is really on just reporting facts and figures and details. They're communicated typically in plain, direct language. And by the way, I should have said this before we started. Lacey sent out notes so that you don't have to scribble, and if you didn't have a chance to download them earlier, they're available so you can get them, so you don't have to worry about taking a lot of notes. Now, moving a little bit to our right, we have presentation. Now, presentations are typically explanatory. The best presentations, though, I've found alternate between a little bit of facts and figures and a little bit of story. They tell story a little bit like peeling back an onion. It's one layer at a time until you see the heart of the story and how it relates to our presentation. The presentation needs to be motivating. It needs to move the audience in a way that they're going to be willing to take action on whatever your recommendation is. And then finally, story. This is where all the drama is. The story is experiential and it's emotional, and sometimes story implies information and sometimes not. Sometimes it's just story. Oh, one of the experts at telling stories is Nancy Duarte. Nancy wrote regarding the objective of story in a presentation. She said the objective of a story in a presentation is to create desire in the audience, and then showing how your ideas fill that desire, move people to adopt your perspective. That in a nutshell is what we're trying to accomplish with the presentations that you're going to deliver for Enactus, is you're going to create a compelling story that's going to move people to take action in the way you want. Now, we talked about story and presentation, but we have stories generally have 3 pieces. There's a situation, a complication, and then a resolution. And so I thought it'd be fun just to take a look at Daniel's in the lion's den. And so the situation for Daniel is pretty clear cut. He's refused to bow down to the king. He continues to pray to God. He gets in a lot of trouble for that. And, unfortunately, the squealers tell the king, and what happens is, the complication is that Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, and he sits there overnight, and then the resolution, obviously, is the angel of God comes along and protects Daniel throughout the night, And then the king comes the next morning and releases him. So that's the resolution to our story. So if you start to think about narrative, you're going to notice that every narrative almost always follows this pattern. There's a situation that's set up, there's a complication that arises, and there's a resolution to the story. Start watching TVs and movies and reading books with this as a perspective. You'll spot it every time. You'll know exactly where they are in the story. So the situation tends to introduce the characters. They create relationships in the story, and they kind of define the hero's unfulfilled desire. What does the hero of our story want? And then complication, that's where our main character runs up against some kind of an obstacle that keeps them from achieving their goal or their desire in our story. And then resolution, as it implies, is this is where the main character either succeeds or fails in his or her quest. Now, presentation with story is a little bit different. It's a little bit more complex, but it begins by painting a picture of the realities of the audience's call, or the audience's current world, what Nancy Duarte calls the call to adventure. And then we have the middle of our story. That's where we present contrasting content, and we're alternating between what is and what could be. And this tension between what is and what could be is what keeps us engaged in the story. And then finally, the story ends, and a story always needs to end on a higher plane than when you began. Even if our hero doesn't succeed, they end on a higher plane. With everybody understanding what the future reward is, Nancy Duarte refers to the end as the call to action. What do we want the audience to do, feel, or say as a result of our presentation? So let's dive in just a little bit to each of these. So we have the beginning. The beginning is a turning point that's explicitly stated. It illustrates the gap that occurs between what is and what could be in our story. And all the rest of the story needs to draw attention back to the difference between what is and what could be. So this dramatic tension that's set up in the beginning of our story by contrasting what is and what could be continues throughout the story. And we need to see a clear gap between the situation as it exists and the situation as we would like it to be. That's how we begin our presentation story. And then we have the middle, the long middle, and that's where we create and resolve tension over and over again between what is and what could be. And that's your job in the middle of the story, is to create and resolve tension by contrasting what is versus what could be. And then third, in the middle of the story, we need to identify the type of contrast that we're going to create, because the way we create tension is in the story is by contrast. And so there's content contrast, so that's where we move back and forth literally between what is and what could be. It's our views maybe perhaps versus what the audience view is, or it's the view of the current situation versus what we would hope the situation would be. And then there's emotional contrast. There's moving back and forth between analytical facts and figures and the emotional content that exists. That's contrast. And then finally, there's delivery contrast. That's moving back and forth between more traditional forms of presentation and non-traditional forms of presentation. So traditional things might be very conservative and primarily driven by facts and figures, and non-traditional contrast might be using video or music that's uplifting or depressing, and it helps set new mood while other things are being talked about. Finally, we get to the end of the story. This is where we have our call to action, which is where we're asking the audience to do, feel, or say something that gets them to where we want them to be. And again, we have the what is situation, but then we have the reward. That's this higher plane that we want our audience to grab onto. And the end needs to be on this higher plane, otherwise the audience is going to be left down in the dumps, and we want them to feel motivated and energized, so we want them up on a higher plane. They have to have a heightened sense of what could be, and they have to be anxious not only to adopt, but to support our idea with everything they've got. Now, if we can instill that kind of enthusiasm in our audience, in your case, in the judges, then you'll get high marks on your presentation. To do that, it's really complicated. You have to understand that not all audience members are alike any more than you all are alike. So if you analyze audience members in general, and in your case, the judges in general, there's really 4 kinds of people that you're going to run into. There's the doers. These are the instigators and the folks that are activity driven. They tend to be the worker bees, and they're the motivators for other people. They want to get things done. They're the ones with to-do lists with little check marks by them that get updated several times a day. And then there's a group of people called suppliers. It's hard to read, my contrast is poor. They're the ones that go out and get resources. The minute they see an issue or a problem, they're thinking about, what do we need to get this done? I can find the resources, whether it's financial or human or material. I'm going to go get what we need. Or if I'm listening to a presentation, that's the question I'm going to have. Did they have the resources they need? Next, we have the influencers. These are the ones that want to change other people's perceptions, or they want to have their own perceptions challenged. These influencers are the ones that tend to be the early adopters. They're the evangelists for an idea. If they get sold on an idea, they're going to be your best friend and evangelist. And influencers are great at helping other people see and understand what's great about what you did. Now, unfortunately, in your judging competition, the judges can't talk to each other, so the influencers can't actually do that. But you still have to understand that in your judging panel, there's probably influencers out there. And the last of our 4 types of people is innovators. These are the guys that generate ideas. They'll listen to what you've got to say, and they'll think, oh yeah, if we did this and if they did that, they could, these are the strategists. They're going to think 10 more things right down the road from where you are, because that's just the way they're wired. Now, if you go back and listen to the 2011 and 2012 global winners, and you listen to the judges' questions, you'll be able to tell from their questions whether they're doers, suppliers, influencers, or innovators, because their questions give them away. It says, well, what did you think about this? How did you do that? Well, is this really practical? Where did you get the supplies to do this? The questions give them away. They're out there. So when you develop your presentation, you need to develop a presentation with the idea in mind that all 4 of these types of people are sitting in your audience, and your presentation better take into account the fact that the strategist is going to wonder, they're going to key in on, hey, did they really develop good strategy? That the supplier person is going to wonder about, well, where did they get the resources? And how did they do this? And did they have enough to make it scalable? And yada, yada, yada. And your doers are going to wonder about, well, hey, how long have you been doing this? Is it really practical? Can you teach other people to do it? Those are the kinds of questions that each of these people is going to ask. They're going to ask different kinds of questions because of the fact that they're different. Now, unfortunately, as I said, you don't know who your judges are, and so you don't know a lot about them. But as a presenter, one of the things you do need to do is you need to treat your audience as though they're the heroes of the story. Now, unfortunately, again, you don't know a lot about your judges, but you need to figure out as much as you can about what judges are. And you can see from the judging criteria that's listed on the website the kinds of things that they're looking for in a judge. And not understanding your audience, not trying to understand what your judges or where they're coming from, it's like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern. It's not going to go very far. So as much as you possibly can, here's what we need to try and understand about our audience, in this case our judges, it's like, who are they? What kind of lifestyles do they lead? What kind of knowledge do they possess? Motivation. What motivates them? What are the desires of their hearts? What are their values? what causes them to influence other people, and how do they respect others? Now, you won't know that for each individual one, but you can know that these are important attributes for every one of the judges, and something in their background caused them to pass through the filter to become a judge. So if you understand the criteria that Enactus uses for selecting judges, you'll know that they come from a variety of backgrounds. There's a lot of business people, there's finance people, production people, operations people, strategy people, people from different backgrounds, social service industries, nonprofit organizations. When you understand where they came from, it gives you a good sense of what they might think about and what's going to be most important to them as an audience member or judge. And so that's how you need to think about them. But your role is a little bit different. Your role needs to be more like that of a mentor. And in this regard, what you need to think about is how can you give the audience what they need to hear, what each one of them specifically needs to hear. You need to give them the guidance that each of them wants to hear. You need to give them the confidence that what you've done and what you're telling them is the best in class. And you need to talk about any tools or skills that might have been used or might be important, because that's the kind of question that some of those 4 personalities are going to ask. So your role as a presenter is to be a mentor and help your audience understand the impact of what you've done in your project, and help them cross the line into saying, gosh, this is the best thing I've seen. Because if they'll cross that line with you by the time you get to the end of the presentation, that's when you get exceptional marks on the grading score. All right, so one of the ways we do that is to create common ground with the judges. Again, even though you don't know who or what they are, where they came from, you need to figure out how to create common ground. And another quote from Nancy is, by identifying and articulating shared experiences and goals, you build a path of trust so strong that the audience feels safe in crossing over to your side. So again, you want to create common ground with the judges. You want to hook up with that emotional side of the judge so that they get why it is you're doing what you're doing through shared experiences, through the ideas of we have common goals, through the qualifications and the systems that you develop. You want to show them that you're creating common ground with them. And the objective here is to increase this level of common ground between you as the presenter, the source of the material, and them as the receivers or the audience of the material. You want to slide those 2 circles closer together so that area of common ground between you and the judges, your audience, is as big as possible, because the more common ground you can create between you and your judge audience, the more willing, the safer they're going to feel in crossing over to accept your proposal or to go along with your idea. So that's your goal in your presentation. Now, every presentation has to have a destination. It's said that if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And that's not the case with your presentation. Your presentation better have a destination, and the content that you provide, every bit of that needs to move your audience closer and closer to the destination. You're time-bound. You can't talk for an hour and a half. You've got to talk about a couple of 3 projects in 15 minutes in such a concise way that it's really clear what your destination for each of these projects is going to be. Now, one of the ways we get to that is by creating what we call a big idea. It's a simple, key message. It's an overarching message. It's a single sentence most of the time that articulates your point of view, and it conveys what's at stake, and it helps you to frame all the work you're going to do in your project, and it helps frame how you'll deliver your presentation. So, for example, a lot of times I'll think about the big idea as having 3 parts. It's kind of like, we are, who are we? What are we doing?
what's kind of our project. What was the result of that? Because of what we did with our project, here's our result. And the impact of that result is this. So you want to create a big idea that overarchingly can protect your project throughout the course of the semester until you deliver your presentation. That big idea needs to guide both your project and your presentation. So it's really important to spend some time thinking about a single big idea that encompasses in one sentence what is most important about what you're doing, your project, what the result is going to be, and then if you achieve that result, what's the impact in society? Because remember, part of our judging criteria is to talk about what was the impact on society as a result of what you did. So you want to make sure that that's part of your big idea. Okay, so now, how do we gather all the content that we're going to need for our presentation? Well, Aristotle did a great job about 400 years before Christ, and he created what's commonly referred to as Aristotle's treatise, and it comes by a couple of other names, but we know it as a persuasion model. And in his model, and you can still get copies of it translated into English today, it's a common tool used in logic classes. Aristotle's model has three components that really he focused on. There's logical appeal, logos. That's evidence through words and structure and data. That's the logical part of the brain. And then there's ethical appeal. That's ethos. And that's where we establish our respect for others. We have credibility that we demonstrate. We demonstrate our character by what we say and do. That's an important part of the persuasion model. If they don't trust you, that's the ethos, the ethical appeal. If they don't trust what you're doing or what you're saying, you lose. So you need to establish trust with your audience. And then finally, the emotional appeal, ethos. It's where we engage the imagination of the audience and we connect with their emotions in a way that hooks them. That's where our story comes in and plays a huge part. Now, all this taken together, there's like 9 steps just to go from where you are in developing your project to beginning to develop a script for a presentation. So here's the 9 steps. Yikes, this really is bad. Okay, the first section is generate ideas. And the idea here is that we get, some sticky notes and each of you in your project sits down and you think, there's a little more contrast. Okay, I need to fix that. Yeah, it's the projector's fault. It's mine. Its contrast looks good on the screen, but not over here. Okay, so we're going to generate ideas. No idea is a bad idea. We're just going to throw all our ideas up on the wall. And then our next step is we're going to kind of filter them down. We're going to take the ideas that we think link up to our big idea the best and support that big idea. We're going to throw away some of these ideas and we're going to bring them here, filter them down. These are the ones that support our big idea the best. And then we're going to cluster them because oftentimes our ideas kind of overlap. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to cluster ideas into kind of subcategories. So you might have a whole bunch of ideas that are around marketing plans. And there might be 10 different ideas of how to develop, or 10 different things that you did in marketing. And so rather than separate ideas, maybe we build them into, okay, here's a bucket of marketing ideas, and within that bucket of marketing ideas, here's what we did for pre-launch awareness, or here's what we did at another stage of our project. So after you filter them down, you cluster your ideas into similar kinds of ideas. And then what we do is we take those clusters and we create a message. So that message is just kind of a simplified, maybe a half a sentence or a sentence that just kind of says, well, what is the overall part of this message that's important to us? What part do we want to tell in our story, in our presentation? And then what we want to do is we want to arrange these messages in order because, this one might be number 1 and 4 and 2 and 3, and so what we want to do then is come back and reorder them. And what we want to do once we've ordered our messages in rank order of importance or the flow of our presentation is we want to come back and then add supporting points. And so adding supporting points is where you go back to your cluster of ideas and take a look at all the ideas that we had and say, okay, how can we build a supporting point in our presentation that illustrates this idea? If this idea is really important because it was through our cluster and into our group of our message, then we need to illustrate that. So we add supporting points, and some of the points might only have a couple, or some of your messages might only have a couple of points. Some of them might have 3, some of them might have 4. It's whatever is necessary to communicate. And then what you do is you strengthen your turning points. So now what we're doing is we've got a message, and remember what I talked to you about in the beginning of our presentation story. We have a turning point, and that's that place where we create this differentiation, this tension between what is and what could be, that gap. And so in our presentation, we want to know where our turning point is. So where are we going to let the judges know that there's this gap between what is and what could be? That tension. They need to feel that tension early in the presentation. And so then you go through the rest of your presentation. This is the middle. And then you come down to the end of your presentation, and this is where you have your last turning point. This is the call to action. So now what we want to do is we want to engage those judges. We want to engage our audience and make them feel like they're right along with us in this story. And so we create this last turning point and the last couple of points that will support that tension and reward that we talked about earlier in the end of our presentation. And then what we want to do is we want to verify that we have a lot of contrast. So the little heart here is just designed to show that this is an emotional aspect. So we're going to come along and we're going to have an emotional point, and then we're going to have a point that isn't emotional. So that's that differentiation or the differential between what is and what could be. That's a tension point. It's illustrated by this little red bar here. So we have, this is a good point, and then this is a point of tension. So we're okay down here, but we have a point of tension up here. And over here we have a good point, and then we end up with a low point, and then another high point. So those tensions, as I talked about in the middle, keep coming and going in the middle of your presentation. And you go through the whole middle, both resolving and creating tension all the way through the middle of your presentation until we finally get to the end in this last turning point. And then what we're trying to do is bring everybody up to this high level. They're bought up with you, they're aligned with you, they can't wait to sign on to the idea that you've delivered to them. And then the last thing you need to do is you need to visualize the message. So this is for the artistic people in the room. Personally, I can't draw a stick figure and make it look right. But what we want to do here is we want to kind of, again, get our little Post-it notes or some 3x5 cards out, and we kind of want to draw what that image looks like. And so I just put a few characters up here. They don't mean anything in particular, but the idea is to say, okay, if I were to draw what this message represents, this number 1 message, and the supporting points, if I was to create a symbol for that, what would it be? And then you want to figure out, okay, where am I going to put that? And for every one of these key points, you want to say, okay, what kind of picture can I use to represent? Because while you're talking, the audience is looking at the screen. The judges are looking at the screen and they're processing. And you want them, the pictures mean a lot to the judge. The picture conveys meaning that your words can't convey all by themselves. That's why in this presentation I gave you pictures and drawings to illustrate different things. So I had, Daniel in the lion's den, and so you instantly see Daniel in the lion's den. You know the story before I even start talking about it. I showed you, what's his name, the actor, quick. Harrison Ford. And instantly you know the stories that go along with the movies. So, you know, that's why we use images. Those images instantly convey something that your words can't convey. So you can be talking and telling a story over here or talking about facts and figures, but the images that you show them behind in the screen convey even more meaning. So that's why I want you to look. I can't give you homework, but my recommendation would be watch the 2012 and 2013 winners and watch them with the lens of what we've been talking about. I'll tell you that the German team is genius in what they did with their story. They didn't waste a second. They created emotional appeal. They created tension between what is and what could be. And they managed to do all of that in, what's the limit, 15 minutes? And then a few minutes for questions. And they only talked about 2 projects. The U.S. team from Belmont, outside of Nashville, I think they talked about 3 projects. They did a great job. They weren't quite as polished as the German team, but they did really, really well. And their audio-visual was, you know, both of the teams had what I would have considered to be, as a P&G guy, professional quality stuff. I was absolutely blown away by the quality of what they delivered. And unless I miss my guess, the German team's entire presentation on the screen was a movie. What they assembled is a movie. So their script and what each person was saying had to uniquely, precisely measure up to what was going to be on the screen at that given moment. It was so precise, it was amazing. And they only stopped a couple of times through so that they could switch to you know, a different vignette, and that would give them a chance clearly to make sure that they were still on track. But I was absolutely amazed by the way they delivered their video, which gets us back to this, how do you portray what you're talking about in a visual way? And again, the Belmont team did the same thing just as well. So now that we've talked about all this, can we have the lights back? I'm kind of done with that part. What I want to do, thank you. What I want to do is now take you back to our story, Corinne's story. And I want to see if you remember a little bit about that story. We have a few minutes, don't we? Yeah, we're good. Okay, so one of the things we talked about with story is that in the beginning of the story, we want to set up our characters. So do you remember how I set up the character in Corinne's story? What did I do?
The mother?
Well, how did I set up the story and establish the introduction?
Go there.
Yeah, I asked you to come along with me. That's right. That's part of it. More?
We noticed her out of the corner of our eye, kind of lurking behind a building before she darts across the street to the abandoned building into the corner.
Okay. All right. Did that setup create an image in your mind?
Yes.
Did you see a frightened little girl, 14, 15 years old, scurrying into a building? Okay, so now we've set up our character, and that's all part of the setup. I talked a little bit too about going to Calcutta, and you know, we're leaving nice Orange County behind, and we're landing in Calcutta. We're leaving the fancy downtown area with the nice hotels and the lights, and we're going into a slum. And then I described what that slum looks like and what it smells like, and you know, the conditions that you see as you enter into this area. So that's all part of the setup for our story. Okay, now where's a tension point early on in the story? You remember the girl she's now in the abandoned building, and she's off in a corner. What's the tension point?
She started crying, and then she let out a scream.
Okay. And she's pregnant. We don't know that yet, but that's another tension point. So what image comes up in your mind when you hear that part of the story?
She's in pain.
She's in pain for some reason. We don't know what's going on yet. So the relief of the tension point is what? We find out why she's in pain. Now what happens right afterwards, we find out she's pregnant. So that's the relief of the tension. So the what is and the what could be, think of it as about creating tension and relieving tension. Creating tension, relieving tension. So she cries out, that creates the tension, then we find out that she's pregnant. That kind of relieves the tension, because we're all familiar with what pregnancy is, even though we see this girl is alone. And then we have tension created again. What happens that creates tension again right after that? Go ahead. She took a drug that induced labor. That's kind of the predecessor to right. What happens next? Well, I told her the age kind of in the setup. Yeah,
The baby comes out and we're not sure if it's alive or not.
exactly. There's your tension point. She's screaming in pain. It sets up tension. And we don't know if the baby's alive because the baby is lying there motionless. So now we've created tension in our story again. How do we relieve the tension? What happens next? Sorry? The baby's alive. The baby cries. It's fighting for breath. It finally breathes and it cries. So now that we relieve the tension. Okay, now, almost immediately, we create tension again with the baby. What did I tell you about the baby that creates tension again?
You put him on cardboard, which isn't tension in and of itself, but then you said bed and then coffin, which automatically, like a gut reaction, what's going to happen to this kid.
Right. We think the baby's going to die because then I also told you about the Hindu belief in reincarnation, and this mother thinks it's better if her baby dies than lives because it'll be consigned to being probably a beggar in Calcutta. Okay, so that creates this tension. And we haven't resolved this tension yet. What happens next? We think the baby is consigned to, death because I've talked about the cardboard and the casket. So what happens next?
You place the baby in the gutter on the street.
Okay, so she gets up and takes the baby outside. We're still under tension at this point. Okay, what do we do to relieve that tension? Back in the back.
We talk about the police officer walking down the street and hearing the noise.
Yeah, exactly. So now, tension gets relieved again by the policeman coming along, finding the baby, picking it up, and what does the policeman do now? Say it louder. Exactly. So now we feel relieved because not only does the policeman pick the baby up, but we all feel good about the baby being in a hospital. That sounds pretty good. Where do we create tension again now that the baby's in the hospital? Somebody over here?
Oh, you don't have like the right care for it, that you have where somewhere that has more money.
Right, exactly. I talked about the fact that there's no neonatal intensive care units and that the baby is 3.5 pounds and most babies don't live. So, okay, it's in a hospital, but things aren't looking up for this baby because most of them don't make it when they're that premature. 3.5 pounds literally will fit in the palm of your hand. So now we've created tension yet again, and almost immediately, though, I give you a little relief from the tension. What did I say next? Yeah.
But they're going to take care of the kid. They feed him, they bathe him, they give him a little physical, and day after day, they take care of him little by little.
Little by little, he gets a little stronger, and he starts putting on a little bit of weight. He's fighting for life. So our tension is resolved yet once again. And then I kind of take you to a whole different place. I talk about a whole new set of characters, and I introduce a whole new set of characters, this adoptive couple. Now, I could tell long stories about the adoptive couple, but it wouldn't have helped our story. So I left all the detail about the adoptive couple out. What's important to this story is just that they're the adoptive couple, and they've now got this baby on the way from India. So the baby makes it, and we change the name of the baby from Taran to Karan. So what does Taran mean?
Say it louder.
Yeah.
Young male. And Quran means ray of light. So we have not tension, but a difference between, in your mind, a throwaway baby that's named Taran, just young male, just one more young male in the world, and Quran, who for this young couple is literally a ray of light in their life. So again, we've created tension and relief of tension. And then I had to show you pictures of family. So the happy ending. And again, I mean, this is literal. I did embellish Justin Coran's story a little bit, but this is literally what the nurses from Mother Teresa's Hospital told us when we adopted him. This is what typically happens to a girl who ends up leaving a baby in the street and they end up in Mother Teresa's Hospital and orphanage. So I put all the facts together that I could find and embellished it a little bit to tell the whole story. But that's an example of how we introduce characters, we create a beginning, we frame the beginning, and we create an introduction to our characters, and then we immediately set up tension, a catastrophic event. Our heroine, the girl, is suddenly confronted with this obstacle of the pregnancy and not knowing what to do. And so she works through that, and then we have a new hero in the baby. And that baby is an obstacle fighting for life. And how does that baby make it? Well, the baby ends up with yet another set of characters, the policemen in the hospital. So again, our story continues to resolve and create tension. Create tension, resolve tension. From low emotional points to high emotional points. All the way through the story until we get to the very end. So that's again why I really want you to look at these two global winners and think about how they told their stories, because some of the things that some of these two teams did are very similar to the projects you guys are doing. There's a project, I can't even remember which team did it. I think it was the Belmont team that did a saving girls from prostitution in Fiji, which is a lot like one of the projects that you guys are doing. And there's another project that's really similar to what you're doing. So you can see parallels, but you can see the way they crafted the story. And then look back at last year's Azusa Pacific presentation and look at that story. And what you'll see there is it was mostly report. They talked a little bit about themselves, used a couple of minutes of their 15 to just say, we're from Azusa Pacific and my name is. And then they kind of got into it. And then they talked about quite a few projects, but they couldn't say too much about each one of them because they'd selected so many. Now here's the problem. The judges is going to look down at you've got the scoring sheet right there. The judge is going to look down at that scoring sheet and they're going to say, for this project, did they communicate all these things? And if you put too many projects in your presentation, you won't be able to deliver on all the criteria. So strategically, you're better off to pick 2 or maybe 3 that you can really blow out and drive home. And I'm sorry for the ones that don't make the cut. I mean, you've worked really hard for a long time, but as a team in developing the overall presentation, you can't develop and present 6 different projects, and they're not all ready anyway. I mean, some of them are just starting, so you don't have enough to go on yet to present. But one of the things that the German team did is they talked about the fact that they divided their projects into 3 sections. There was a section of beginning projects, there's a section of projects that have been around for 2 or 3 years, and then there's a section of projects in that area where they're ready to turn the project loose. They're now so sustainable that they're willing to pull away from it and let the people in the country that they were working with run the project from now on. So they talked about, here's one of our projects that fit into this bucket, and here's a project that fit into this bucket. And so they framed the way they told the story that way. So I want to leave you with just kind of one last thing, and that's some resources
And I know it's not like you don't have enough to read already, but if you want to get some first-class resources on how to tell a story, look at anything that Nancy Duarte has written. These are two of them. Resonate, which is where I frankly, unabashedly used a lot of her material from Resonate in this short little presentation that I gave you today. There's a lot more in there, and I bet the library's got it. The next one is Slideology. When it comes time to actually develop your presentation, Nancy is absolutely genius in designing and developing presentations, and that's information, that knowledge is captured in Slideology. And then another one is Presentation Zen, and I like this one a lot too. It'll help you when it comes time to create your presentation, to craft the words around the presentation. And then finally, Lead with a Story by Paul Smith. This is a sales guy who practiced the art of telling stories as part of a sales presentation. And he tells dozens of stories throughout the course of the book that provide examples of how somebody used a story in a presentation. It's a quick read. It's a couple of hundred pages. You finish it in a few hours. Or you could just jump to sections that are interesting to you, because literally each story is kind of a little capsule of 2 or 3 pages on its own. So there's 4 resources for you. So you're nowhere near that point yet, but when you get ready for developing your final presentation, Slideology and Presentation Zen are going to be helpful, especially the Slideology. And right now, as you start thinking about how do I craft this overall message, looking at Resonate would be really helpful, because it's never too early to start planning what your presentation is going to need to look like. Why? Because part of what the 2 global winners did is they had interviews with people that were in the project that they worked with. So they had interviews with people from Africa and from Fiji. And you can't turn that on and have it ready to go overnight. So what they had done clearly is they thought weeks or months ahead and said, what are we going to need in our final presentation? And then along the way, they started gathering all that material so that when they got to the end, they had incredible pictures and videos and movie vignettes that they could string together and build their presentations. So they clearly started early. If you wait until towards the end to start thinking about what is our presentation going to look like, you won't have gotten all that foundational material, or you're going to have to really scurry to get it, and your end product won't be as clean. It won't be as dramatic. It won't be as impactful. All right, that's all I wanted to cover tonight. So we're a little early. I'll take questions if you have any, or what would you like to do? We have a few minutes. Any questions?